Exercise 10.2.
Listen to a discussion in an anthropology class.
Morning, class. I want to start off this morning with a question for you. How many of you have ever been to a potluck dinner? Oh, lots of you, I see. Okay, who can describe a potluck dinner for me? Andy?
It's just a dinner where all the guests bring dishes to share with everyone else. Someone might bring salad, someone might bring dessert.
It's a way you can have a dinner party with your friends and not spend $1 million, because everyone brings something.
You're right. Well, today we're going to be discussing a ceremony called the potlatch.
I'm sorry, the what?
The potlatch. Here, I'll put it on the board for you. This is a ceremony held by Native Americans and Native Canadians in the Pacific Northwest, from Washington State north to British Columbia all the way up to Alaska. Potlatches were held for all kinds of reasons. To celebrate births, weddings, naming ceremonies, even a good catch of salmon. Now, some linguists think that the English word potluck might be derived from this word potlatch. The word potlatch is originally from the Chinook language. The Chinooks were a group of Native Americans who lived along the Columbia River. A form of their language called Chinook trade jargon became a trade language, a language used by tribes all over the region to communicate with one another. So the word potlatch spread, and before long it was used by all the tribes in the Pacific Northwest.
Professor Burke, were these potlatches, were they sort of like the potlucks we have today?
Well, no. As a matter of fact, they were quite a bit different. I suppose the best way to describe a potlatch is as a birthday party in reverse.
Huh? A birthday party in reverse? What do you mean?
Well, at a birthday party, what happens? The guests all bring gifts, right? At a potlatch, it's the host who gives the gifts and the guests who receive them.
Sounds like a pretty good deal for the guests.
Well, in a way it was, but in a way it wasn't. Let me describe a typical potlatch to you. A host, it was often a chief or an important person of some kind, would invite people from his tribe or from other tribes in the area. The guests would arrive and there would be some dancing. Then the guests would be seated and the host and his family, his relatives, would serve the guests a huge formal feast.
Professor Burke, excuse me, I couldn't help wonder, what kind of food would be served at these potlatches?
Well, the tribes that had potlatches all lived near the ocean, so what kind of food do you think they served?
I'm guessing fish.
Right. Mostly salmon. Salmon was the staple food of the Northwest tribes. They spent a lot of their time salmon fishing and then preserving salmon. They might also serve whale meat or seal meat or venison. They'd dip these foods into pots of seal oil to give them more flavor, and the host would always serve more than the guests could possibly eat. Okay, then after the feasting, the host would start distributing gifts.
What kind of gifts would the host give away?
Well, the most common gift was food, salmon. The host would pack smoked fish in these elaborately carved boxes. Other gifts they might give: goat hair blankets, jewelry, wooden masks, and after these tribes came in contact with Americans and Canadians of European origin, the gifts became more varied. There might be sacks of flour, dishes, eating utensils. I even remember seeing a photograph of a potlatch from, around 1900, where a guest is receiving a sewing machine.
So, what else happened at a potlatch?
Well, then the host would usually destroy some of his most valuable possessions, such as fishing canoes, and he'd throw coins and almost anything valuable into the sea.
What? Excuse me, Professor, I just don't get it. It just seems kind of crazy to me. Why would anyone want to host a party like that?
Okay, well, first off, gift-giving rituals like this are not all that uncommon. I mean, there have been societies all around the world that have gone in for these types of ceremonies, but having said that, I can't think of any other society where it was such a central part of the culture. See, these tribes, to them, status, prestige, Well, in short, they were highly status conscious. To them, looking good in the eyes of other people was very, very important. And that's what a potlatch was all about. It was a means of establishing rank, status, power.
How's that?
Well, by accepting gifts at a potlatch, the guests, they acknowledged the wealth and the generosity of their hosts. And when they were destroying or throwing away valuables, the hosts were really saying, "I'm so important, I'm so wealthy, I can afford to smash up my stuff and throw away my money."
Well, I still think it was a much better deal to be a guest than to be a host at these parties.
But you see, Andy, there was a catch. In some ways, potlatches were actually a form of investment.
Investment?
Sure. All the guests at a potlatch were honor-bound to pay the host back by having potlatches of their own and inviting the host.
Oh, I get it. It was an investment because then the host would be invited to lots of potlatches.
Right. And the potlatches that the guests held had to be at least as elaborate as the one they'd been invited to. There was this one tribe called the Kwakiutl who lived up on Vancouver Island. Now, this group, they really turned the potlatch into an art form. They had the most elaborate, most ritualistic potlatches of all the tribes in the Northwest. When the Kwakiutl held potlatches, they would use the ceremony as a kind of weapon, a form of revenge against their enemies. They'd throw such extravagant potlatches that their enemies would go broke trying to match them.
Wow, that was a clever way to get back at their enemies.
So, do these tribes still have potlatches?
That's really a good question. Both the U.S. government and the Canadian government banned potlatches back in the 1880s, although some tribes no doubt held potlatch ceremonies in secret. I suppose government officials just somehow didn't like the idea of people giving away their possessions. At the time, they didn't realize how important potlatches were, important culturally, socially, religiously to the tribes. But nowadays, in fact, ever since the 1930s in Canada and the 1950s in the United States, potlatches are legal again. If anything, they're an even more essential element of these societies than they were before.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 1. What does the professor say about the word potlatch? Question 2. What was the most common gift at a potlatch? Question 3. What purpose did seal oil serve at a potlatch? Question 4. What does Professor Burke imply about the photograph of a potlatch taken in 1900? Question 5. What does Professor Burke say about the Kwakiutl tribe? Question 6. What does Professor Burke say about potlatch ceremonies held today? Listen to a lecture in a space science class.
As I said at the end of our class on Tuesday, today I'm going to talk about a growing problem in the sky. You can call it space junk, space debris, orbital litter, whatever you like. It's basically the leftovers from the thousands of satellites and spacecraft that have been sent into orbit over the last 50 years or so. The problem started back in the late 1950s. The Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik it was called, in 1957. And that That's when a tracking network was first set up, too, to monitor bodies in orbit. Today, there's a worldwide network of 21 telescopes and radar stations called the Space Surveillance Network that keeps track of all this stuff, all these items in space. Almost every launch contributes to the problem, contributes to the amount of junk up there circling the Earth. There are non-functioning satellites, food wrappers, an astronaut's glove, the lens cap from a camera, broken tools, bags of unwashed uniforms. Luckily, most of this junk burns up when it re-enters the atmosphere, just like little meteors. And although old pieces fall out of the sky, new pieces are launched. On average, there's a net increase of around 200 pieces per year. Today, there are around 13,000 pieces, 13,000 separate bodies that are monitored from Earth. And of those, only about 400 are still active, still useful pieces of equipment. Most of it is in what is called low Earth orbit, that's defined as within 1,200 miles of the Earth. There's also about 1,000 pieces in high orbit. It's in a very thin, very narrow ring, shaped like a bicycle tire, about 22,000 miles above the equator. The surveillance people can only monitor objects bigger than about a baseball. There are probably, I'd say, about 500,000 pieces of debris that are just too small to be monitored. Most of these small objects are tiny flecks of paint or little pieces of metal, say around the size of a grain of sand. Some orbital debris is huge, big as a bus. The smallest pieces are not that dangerous, not usually. When they hit a spacecraft, they only cause, just some surface damage. Several times, outer windows on the space shuttle have had to be replaced because of collisions with micro-objects in space, but there was no real danger. And the really big pieces, those are mostly empty booster rockets or other rocket parts. They're not necessarily all that dangerous either. Why not? Because these large objects can be detected by radar, and so they can be avoided fairly easily. Several times, shuttles have had to maneuver to avoid getting close to large pieces of debris. But it's the medium-sized pieces that represent the biggest danger. These objects are so dangerous, of course, because of their tremendous speed. They can be moving up to 12 miles per second. That's way faster than a bullet. Your typical bullet doesn't even travel 1 mile per second. If one of these flying pieces of debris, say a lost screwdriver or a piece of an antenna that broke off a satellite, if one of these hit a space shuttle or the International Space Station, it could puncture the outer hull. Then what would happen? You'd have depressurization. All of the air inside would rush out into the vacuum of space, and then you'd have a disaster on your hands. So far, fortunately, there has never been a major collision involving a manned spacecraft. But space debris has damaged the solar panels on an unmanned communications satellite, and there have also been some collisions of these pieces of debris themselves. In January of 2005, the engine from a Thor rocket launched by the United States 30 years ago and a fragment of a Chinese rocket that blew up 5 years ago met over Antarctica. The event was recorded by a camera on a surveillance satellite. The collision produced even more pieces of space junk. So, what can we do? What can be done about this problem? Well, a couple of years ago, space engineers came up with an idea, a possible way to solve this debris problem. Here's what they suggested. You build a junk collector, a large cone or group of cones that fits on the front of a spacecraft. The cone is full of sticky plastic fibers that trap debris inside it. The invention is still in its conceptual stage, but there are two ways it might be used. You could launch unmanned satellites equipped with these devices and radar sensors, and you could actively hunt down dangerous pieces of space junk. Or you could put one of these on the front of a manned spacecraft and use it as a defensive shield. Oh, and another possible solution. You could use laser guns, either on a space-based platform or based here on Earth, to shoot some of the smaller pieces out of the sky. Okay. Anyone have any questions for me?
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 7. What happens to most pieces of orbital debris? Question 8. How many orbital bodies are being monitored today? Question 9. Why is it impossible to monitor most pieces of orbital debris? Question 10. Which of the following types of orbital debris would not be particularly dangerous to astronauts on a spacecraft? Question 11. The professor describes a collision in space between which of the following objects? Question 12. What can be inferred about the collector described in this portion of the talk? Listen to a discussion in a pharmacy class.
Good morning, all. This is our last class before the final, you know. And I told you I'd give you a little more information about the test today. But before I do that, I want to talk about a different class of drugs. This term, we've been discussing different types of pharmaceutical drugs. Today, though, I'd like to spend a little time discussing another class of drugs. You could lump them all together and call them herbal drugs or herbal remedies.
Oh, I just read a magazine article about herbal drugs. It said that herbal remedies were becoming more and more popular.
That's probably true. I've heard that, something like 12 million people in the United States use herbal drugs. And worldwide, well, there are countries where herbal remedies are as important, maybe even more important than pharmaceutical drugs.
So, Professor Finley, what do you think? Why is it important for pharmacists to know about herbal medicines? I mean, usually patients don't get prescriptions and come to pharmacists for herbal remedies, do they? They just buy them at, health food stores and so on, right?
Well, there are several reasons, Thomas. For one thing, pharmaceutical and herbal medicine they share a lot of history. I mean, think about it. At one time, all drugs came from herbs and other plants. At one time, the pharmacist was just some guy, usually some woman, who knew what herbs were helpful and knew where to look for them. Also, a lot of pharmaceutical drugs in use today, they originally came from herbal sources.
Really? Which ones?
Well, the most commonly taken drug of all, good old aspirin, is one example. The active ingredient in aspirin originally came from the bark of a tree, the white willow tree. And anyone remember a drug we talked about last month called digitalis?
I do. It's used to treat heart problems, right?
You're correct. And digitalis originally came from a plant called foxglove. Anyway, to introduce you to alternative medicine, I brought along some samples of plants that are often used in herbal medicines. See this flower that looks like a purple daisy?
It's a pretty little flower. What is it?
Well, some people call it the herbal equivalent of a flu shot. It's called echinacea.
Oh, I read about that. Doesn't it work on the immune system?
Right. Well, lots of people think it does anyhow. It's one of the most commonly taken herbal remedies. A lot of people, when they feel a cold or the flu coming on, will take echinacea.
What are those yellow flowers with the 5 petals?
Those are called St. John's wort. St. John's wort. It's used to reduce stress and for mild depression. Now here's a plant you might find of interest at this time of year with finals coming on. See this fan-shaped leaf? It's from the ginkgo biloba tree.
What's that one for?
Ginkgo biloba is thought to improve memory and to help you be more alert, more focused.
Is that right? Wow, we really should try some of that. So, Professor, how do most people take these drugs? Do they just swallow them?
I'd imagine the most common way to take them is in powdered form. The leaves or flowers are crushed and powdered and put in a capsule, and people swallow the capsule. Another way, well, some people make tea from the plants and drink the tea, although I'm told that most of these herbs taste pretty nasty.
Here's what I don't understand. Why would someone use herbal drugs when there are regular drugs, pharmaceutical drugs that do the same thing?
Well, Thomas, for one thing, a lot of herbal drugs are a form of preventative medicine. In other words, people tend to take these drugs to avoid getting sick. On the other hand, most prescription drugs are used after somebody gets sick. I mean, to treat some specific problem. Then for another thing, a lot of people that use these drugs, they think that herbal remedies have fewer side effects and are generally, safer than prescription drugs.
What do you think, Professor? Do you think that's true? Are they safer?
Well, I'd have to say not always. There are some herbs I would never recommend, and there are definitely some herbal drugs that some people, for example, pregnant women, people with high blood pressure, these folks should definitely not take these drugs.
But Professor, do you think they work? I mean, are most herbal remedies as effective as prescription drugs?
I don't really have a simple answer for that question, Thomas. I think that in some cases they might be. But not all that much research has been done on herbal drugs, so there isn't that much scientific proof.
Why is that, Professor? Why no research?
That's easy. Because drug research, most of the research done on drugs, is done by pharmaceutical companies that hope to patent the drug and then to make a profit on it. But guess what? You can't patent a herb, since, it's a natural substance. So,
Professor, as a pharmacist, would you ever tell a patient to take herbal medicine instead of a prescription drug?
Well, I might, depending on the medical situation, but there are several considerations. Patients need to take a few precautions. First, they should be sure that they get herbs from a reputable company, a dependable company, to make sure the herbs they're taking are pure. They should also talk to their doctors and their pharmacists, especially if they are taking any other drugs, because there's always the possibility drugs and herbs, there could be a serious drug-herb interaction. Finally, I'd remind patients not to expect miracles from herbs. I mean, let's face it, no herbal remedy can take the place of exercise and a healthy diet.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 13. What point does Professor Findlay make about the drugs aspirin and digitalis? Question 14. According to Professor Findlay, why do people generally take the herbal remedy echinacea? Question 15. Which of the following is the best description of St. John's wort? Question 16. What can be inferred from the professor's remarks about how most herbal medicines are used? Question 17. In what form are herbal remedies most often taken? Question 18. According to the professor, why has research on herbal drugs been limited? Listen to a lecture in a U.S. history class.
Good afternoon, class. Today I want to talk a little about something that's done more, I think, to shape the landscape of the United States as it is today than, probably more than just about any other phenomenon: the interstate highway system. The interstate system has been called the largest public works project in the history of the country, maybe in the history of the world, and it's definitely one of the world's great engineering wonders. When the Century Highway in Los Angeles was completed in 1993, it marked the end, almost the end. There were still some bits and pieces that weren't finished, but it effectively marked the end of a 40-year project that cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Okay, let's take a trip back in time. Let's go back to the early part of the 20th century. Let's say you've just bought a brand new automobile, maybe a shiny new Model A Ford. Here's your problem. You can drive your car around the city, but if you want to go from city to city, there are no roads to speak of. When the weather is bad, people joke about losing automobiles in the mud. In fact, in many places, roads are probably worse than they were 100 years before. Anyone guess why? No? Okay. Remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about how, after the Civil War, the railroad became dominant, the dominant form of transportation? Does that ring a bell? So what was one of the side effects of this? The roads meant for horses, for carts, for carriages, these all fell into disrepair because passengers and goods all moved by railroad. There was no reason to maintain roads. Anyway, you've got these terrible roads, no way to get from place to place. So what do you motorists do? You organize, you form groups, and then you demand that the government build roads. These groups of motorists went by a lot of different names, depending on where they were, but collectively they were known as the Better Roads Movement. And the government responded. It responded slowly, but it responded. Roads were built, but it would be years, many years, before there was a comprehensive highway system. Okay, let's move ahead in time a few years. It's 1919, and a young Army officer, whose name is Dwight David Eisenhower, is ordered to lead a military convoy of trucks and motorcycles across the country, from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California. He's ordered to get there as soon as possible. It takes him, you might find this hard to believe, but it took him 62 days. 62 days! Okay, now it's the 1930s, the time of the Great Depression, as I know you'll remember, and there are millions of unemployed workers, millions, and President Roosevelt put some of them to work on public works projects. These projects include road building. In 1938, the first superhighway opens. It's called the Pennsylvania Turnpike. You may have traveled on it yourself and not found it all that exciting. However, at the time it opened, it was known as the Dream Road. This 4-lane highway became a model for the highways of the future. So, after World War II, the United States really and truly enters the automobile age. By 1950, there are over 50 million vehicles on the road. In 1954, Dwight David Eisenhower, he's the President of the United States by now, he proposes a system of superhighways. This system would basically connect all of the major cities in the United States. Of course, Eisenhower has been interested in roads for a long time. There were two major events in his life that influenced the way he thinks about highways. One is his wartime experience. He was commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, and he saw, the advantage that the efficient German Autobahn system, the German superhighway system, he saw the advantage this gave Germany during the war. The other event? It's that long, hard trip he took across the country back in 1919. So, in 1956, Congress passes the Federal Highway Act, and the first section of the interstate system is built in Kansas, Eisenhower's home state. The system is supposed to be completed by 1972, but it's not finished, as I said, until the 1990s. The interstate highway system has had just an enormous impact on life in the United States. It's created millions of jobs. It's provided an incredibly efficient system for moving people and transporting goods around the country. And because of that, it's contributed to the decline of the railroads. Because of the safety factors that were built into the system, it's probably saved thousands of lives. It's helped create the suburbs that surround every U.S. city. Now, it's true there were suburbs before there were interstate highways, but the interstate system has helped accelerate their growth because, well, it's just so easy to travel from suburb to central city. Now, don't get me wrong, not all the effects of this superhighway system have been, well, positive, especially in urban areas. There have been whole neighborhoods destroyed to make way for roads. Just in Seattle, for example, thousands of homes were destroyed to make way for Interstate 5. Whole neighborhoods were, well, it was like having a river, a concrete river, a river of traffic cut through a neighborhood, or cut it off from other neighborhoods. There was opposition. There were protests. In Boston in 1966, an anti-highway group successfully blocked the building of a highway called the Inner Belt. Another group stopped the building of an interstate highway through San Francisco. Still, for better or worse, the interstate highway system has changed the face of the United States. And remember that trip from Washington to San Francisco in 1919 that took Eisenhower 62 days? Today you can make that same trip in just 72 hours.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 19. Which of the following caused the decline of roads in the United States in the 19th century? Question 20. How long did it take Dwight David Eisenhower to drive across the United States in 1919? Question 21. According to the speaker, which of these influenced the way President Eisenhower thought about highways? Question 22. When was the interstate highway system originally supposed to have been completed? Question 23. Which of the following is not given as an effect of the interstate highway system? Question 24. In which of these cities were interstate highway projects blocked by protests? Listen to a discussion among students preparing a presentation for an architecture class.
Okay, so the presentation on alternative housing in Professor Maxwell's class is going to be, what, the 21st?
Let me check. No, it's not until the 23rd, but we have to hand in a preliminary outline next Tuesday.
And this presentation counts for, I think it's a fourth of our grade, so we need to do a good job.
Right. So either of you do any research or decide what kind of housing we should talk about?
Well, I looked at a couple of websites on the internet and paged through some journals, but I didn't really come up with much of anything. How about you, Joyce?
As a matter of fact, I have some, I guess you could call it indirect experience with one type of alternative housing. I think I told you my uncle owns a construction company, and, last year he had these clients, this couple come to him and say they wanted him to help them build a kind of house called an earthship. They showed him the plans, and at first he thought they were nuts, but, well, he needed the business, so he helped them build the house, the earthship, and he ended up thinking, well, he's actually thinking of building an earthship for himself.
An earthship? Huh? That sounds like something from a science fiction movie.
Yeah, I guess it does.
So, what's so interesting about earthships?
Well, for one thing, they're made almost entirely out of recycled materials. In fact, the main building materials are old tires and aluminum cans. The outer walls consist of used tires packed with soil. Then you take the aluminum cans and tuck them between the tires, and then you cover the walls with cement.
You're kidding. I mean, I hate to say this, but used tires, old cans, dirt, cement, those aren't the most attractive building materials.
I know. They don't sound that attractive, not at all. But, you can finish the interior, the inside of the earthship, any way you want. You can finish the walls with plaster and paint them, or you can use wood panels. I've seen pictures of the one my uncle built. It's full of plants and art, and believe me, it looks really nice.
Well, Maxwell should love them. You know how she feels about building with recycled materials.
Yeah, but that's not all. Earthships are not only made from recycled materials, they also use very, very little power. They generate their own electricity from solar panels. These are up on the roof. And they use passive solar heating to provide heat in the winter.
Really? How do they do that?
Well, earthships are basically shaped like the letter U. The three walls made of tires are on the west, north, and east sides. The open part of the U, which is on the south side, is made of glass windows, and they're angled upward to catch the winter sunlight.
Yeah, this definitely sounds like the kind of house Maxwell would love.
What about costs? How much does an earthship cost?
Well, dirt, aluminum cans, a lot of the materials are either free or almost free. And a lot of times the owners help build the houses themselves. Earthships are a real bargain. My uncle's clients get a small nest for, well, I'm guessing, but it probably only cost them about $40,000, not counting the land it was built on.
What do you mean, a nest?
Oh, that's the most basic form of earthship, the smallest type. Of course, you can spend a lot more if you build a big, fancy one.
Well, I vote we do our presentation on earthships then, since Joyce already knows a lot about them, and they sound pretty interesting to me, too.
I'll go along with that. Like I say, I think Maxwell will love them, and she's the one who gives the grade.
Joyce, if you could get me some plans, I bet I could build a small model before we give our presentation.
Well, detailed plans are pretty expensive, but I can probably get you some photos of the earthship that my uncle helped build.
That's probably all I'd need, as long as they show the house from all sides.
But would you have time to make a model before the presentation?
Oh, I'm sure I can. I can make a simple architectural model of just about anything in a couple of days.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 25. How did Joyce get most of her information about earthships? Question 26. Which of these are not one of the main building materials used to construct earthships? Question 27. Which of the walls of an earthship is made of glass? Question 28. What is meant by the term nest? Question 29. Why does Joyce call Earthships a real bargain? Question 30. What will the students probably bring to the presentation? Listen to a lecture in a political science class.
Afternoon. How's everyone today? Good. So, we've spent the best part of the last couple weeks going over the structure of the federal government and talking about the document that provides the basis for government structure, the U.S. Constitution. Today, as promised, we're going to take a look at the structure of the states, of the individual state governments in the United States. There are two main types of government, two main systems of governing in the world. Under the unitary system, the national government, the central government, has a great deal of control over the regional and local governments. For example, the central government may completely control the budgets of the provinces, the states, the departments, whatever the political subdivisions are called. The national president may appoint the governors of these regional units. Actually, most of the national governments in the world are of this type, unitary. The other type, the other system of government, is the federal system. Under this system, the constituent parts of the nation have a great deal of power. Only about 24, 25 nations in the world are considered to have federal systems. The oldest one of these is the United States. The reason that the U.S. has a federal system is because of our history. Before independence, the 13 British colonies were ruled separately. People from the colony of Virginia, for example, considered themselves Virginians, really, not Americans. So then, after the Revolutionary War, the former colonies, well, as you can imagine, they each jealously guarded their own independence. When the states signed the Constitution, they surrendered some of their sovereign power. But here's the thing. The Constitution says that whatever powers are not given directly to the federal government belong to the state governments. So, compared to other countries, well, there may be a few countries that have an equally decentralized system. Switzerland comes to mind. The Swiss states, they're actually called cantons there, they have a great deal of power, too. And so do the Canadian provinces. But if you look at other countries, France has always had a very centralized system of government. Paris has traditionally controlled everything. Now, this may be becoming less true. There's been some decentralization in recent years, but still it's a unitary system. And if you look at the United Kingdom, well, local governments there have a fair amount of power, but there is nothing comparable, really, to state governments. Britain is divided into regions, but these regions have no real governments to speak of. Again, maybe someday soon they will, but for now, we'd have to consider the UK's system of government more or less a unitary system. So, anyway, my point here is, compared to most comparable political units around the world, the U.S. states are pretty powerful. What kind of powers do the states have? They collect taxes. They regulate businesses that operate within the state. They issue licenses, like driver's licenses, marriage licenses. They build roads. What else? Well, they're involved in education, mostly with higher education. All the states operate a state university system. Elementary schools, secondary schools, Those are mostly controlled by local school boards. Now, as we said earlier, the structure of the federal government, the rules for operating the federal government, these are determined by the U.S. Constitution. Likewise, each state has its own constitution that determines its structure. Massachusetts has the oldest constitution. In fact, it's older than the national constitution. Granted, it's been changed some since then, but it's really the same document that was adopted in 1780. We said the federal government was divided into three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. Same is true of the states. The chief of the executive branch is called the governor, as you no doubt know. The governor, this is true in all the states, is elected for a 4-year term. In about half the states, the governor can serve only 2 terms. In about half, he can serve as many as he wants. In one state, Virginia, the governor can only serve 1 term. The state legislatures serve the same purpose as the U.S. Congress. Members of the legislature are elected. They make laws, they set tax rates, and in all of the states except Oregon, they can impeach. Know what I mean? They can throw out the governor. Like the U.S. Congress, state legislatures have a bicameral structure. This means they are divided into 2 bodies, 2 houses. The upper house is called the State Senate. The lower house, well, it has different names depending on what state you're in. Oh, and when I said every state has a bicameral legislature, I should have said all but one of them do. Nebraska is the exception. Nebraska is unique because it has only 1 house, so it has a unicameral system, just 1 house. State Supreme Courts, those represent the judicial branch. Their job is to interpret the state constitution, just like the U.S. Supreme Court does, and to try various cases. In some states, they are elected. In some states, they are appointed by the governor or the legislature. In most states, they serve terms of 8 to 10 years, but in Rhode Island, they're appointed for life. Next up, we're going to take an in-depth look at the structure of our own state government. I'm going to pass out copies of the Ohio State Constitution in just a minute. But anyone have any questions first?
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 31. What does the professor say about the unitary system of government? Question 32. What does the professor say about Switzerland? Question 33. According to the professor, which of the following is mainly responsible for primary and secondary education in the United States? Question 34. Which of these states has the oldest constitution? Question 35. What is the maximum time that a governor of Virginia can serve? Question 36. What is unique about the state legislature of Nebraska? Listen to a discussion in a dance class.
Okay, everyone, we've been talking about traditional forms of dance. Today, we're going to shift our attention to the islands of Hawaii and the most famous form of dance that's associated with those beautiful islands. Anyone know what that is? Laura?
Oh, that's an easy one. It's the hula dance.
Yeah, you're right. It's the hula. You don't have to say hula dance, actually, because the word hula means dance in Hawaiian, in the Hawaiian language. Has anyone ever seen this dance performed or know anything about it? James?
Well, I've seen a couple of TV shows and movies about Hawaii, and it seems to me that usually when you see the hula, it's done by women in long grass skirts.
Laura?
When I was a little kid, my parents took me to Hawaii, and there were hula dancers who'd perform at our hotel. I remember being fascinated by how gracefully they moved their bodies and their hands.
Yeah, and you know, those body movements and gestures, they all have meaning. The dancers use those to tell stories. But what I want to emphasize, really emphasize, is the fact that the hula that's performed today for tourists, the one you see at hotels and cultural shows, is very different from the traditional hula, the one that was performed hundreds of years ago. Modern hula is called hula awane. The old-style traditional hula is called hula kahiko.
Hundreds of years ago? I didn't realize it was such an old dance.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, we don't even know exactly how old the hula is. We do know that when Captain Cook visited the islands in the 1770s, he was the first European to go there. He was allowed to see a hula on the island of Kauai. He wrote in his journal how much he enjoyed it. We also know that one of the queens of Hawaii established a royal school of hula over 500 years ago. Back then, both men and women took part in the dance. There were two types of performers. There were young performers, called alapa, which means graceful ones in Hawaiian. These were the dancers, the ones that actually performed the dance. Then there were older performers called hoapa, which means steady ones. They chanted and sang, and they also played musical instruments. Apparently back then, hula ceremonies could get quite wild. But all that changed in 1820.
Why? What happened then?
That was the year the religious missionaries came to Hawaii from the United States, from New England to be specific. They found the original form of the hula to be a little, shocking. So they arranged to have the hula completely banned for around 50 years. Then, when it came back, it was a much tamer version, a much more conservative dance, the hula awane.
So how was it different?
Well, remember I told you that the hula tells stories through movements? In the old days, the hula, probably the most important story was the story of how the islands rose up out of the sea. Also, there were dances about the Hawaiian gods and goddesses, especially the goddess Laki, who was the special goddess of the hula. Some dances told the stories of brave Hawaiian kings and queens, stories of Hawaiian history. But in the modern version of the dance, the movements of the dance, they usually represent some natural phenomena, such as palm trees swaying in the wind, or waves crashing on the beach, or birds flying across the sky.
Professor, what about the music for the hula? It's, a lot of times you hear it played on the ukulele, right? Has that always been true? Is the ukulele a traditional instrument?
No, not at all. There was a group of Portuguese workers who came to Hawaii around 1870, and they brought with them these small guitars that were common in Portugal back then. These little guitars eventually evolved into ukuleles. Oh, by the way, in Hawaiian, the word ukulele means jumping flea.
Jumping flea? Yeah? Why did they call it that?
Probably it was because, to tell you the truth, I don't have a clue. I'll try to find out for you, though.
So, how did it get to be a tourist attraction?
In the 1950s, tourism became a major industry in Hawaii, and tourists wanted to see samples of authentic Hawaiian culture. even though the modern hula is, well, it's not really an expression of Hawaiian culture, not the way the traditional hula was. But then, most tourists probably didn't know the difference.
Well, personally, I think it's too bad that you can't see what the hula was like back in the old days. I bet it was a lot more interesting than what you see now.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that, but actually, you can. These days, there are several groups of Hawaiian dancers that have gotten together to perform the hula kahiko the way it was originally performed. In fact, I have a video of one of their performances, and we'll be taking a look at that next.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 37. What does the word hula mean in the Hawaiian language? Question 38. What fact about the hula does the professor particularly emphasize? Question 39. What roles did the hoa pa, or steady ones, play in the performance of the hula? Question 40. What did the New England missionaries do when they arrived in 1820? Question 41. Which of the following would be the most likely theme of a modern hula? Question 42. What will the members of the class do next?
Lesson 11. Purpose, Method, and Attitude questions. Sample Item 1.
Listen to a part of a discussion from the listening preview test.
Well, you see, Professor Longdell, he in fact taught in the law school at Harvard, not in the business school. So the case method it was first used to train law students. Then a couple of years after that, they started using it at Columbia University, at the law school there. It wasn't until, when was it? Probably about 1910, 1912, something like that it was first used at Harvard Business School.
Then it's used in other fields besides law and business?
Oh, sure. Over the years, it's been used in all sorts of disciplines. For example, my wife, she teaches over at the School of Education. She uses cases to train teachers.
Why does Professor Speed mention his wife?
Sample Item 2.
Listen to a part of a student presentation from an astronomy class.
Well, hi, everyone. Monday, we heard Dawn tell us about the sun, and Lisa talk about Mercury, the planet closest to the sun. My report. What I'm talking about is the next planet, the second planet, Venus. Okay, to start off, I'm going to tell you what they used to think about Venus. First off, back in the really ancient days, people thought Venus was a star, not a planet. And, well, actually, you know how you can see Venus in the early morning and in the evening? Well, so they thought it was two stars. Phosphorus, that was the morning star, and, Hesperus, the evening star. And then once they figured out it was just one planet, they named it Venus after the goddess of love. I don't really know why, though.
How does the speaker introduce the topic of Venus?
Sample Item 3.
Listen to part of a conversation from the listening preview test.
So you don't think that's a very good idea for a topic then, I suppose?
I didn't say that. Just because this theory hasn't been proven doesn't mean you couldn't write a perfectly good paper about this topic on the notion that animals can predict earthquakes. Why not? It could be pretty interesting. But to do a good job, you'll need to look at some serious studies in the scientific journals, not just some pop science articles in newspapers, and you can't get your information from television shows.
What is the professor's attitude toward the topic that the student wants to write about?
Exercise 11.1.
Listen to a conversation between two students.
So, Joan, your roommate told me that you had a meeting with Dean Metzger this morning.
Well, actually, it's later this afternoon. I'm meeting her at 4 today.
How come?
Well, I'm sure you've been hearing and reading about the cuts in the university budget, right? Well, the budget for the university debate team was really slashed. In fact, it was cut more than in half, and it was already a bare-bones budget. To tell you the truth, I don't know I don't really think we'll be able to keep debating.
Really? So what does the debate team spend its money on? The coach's salary or...
No, as a matter of fact, my friend Kurt Wyndham is our coach, and he volunteers his time. Kurt's a graduate student now, but when he was an undergrad, he was a debater himself.
So then, how do you spend your money?
Well, mostly we spend it on travel expenses. We take 4 or 5 trips a semester to other campuses, and we need money for bus fares or gas money, hotel rooms, meals, things like that.
Well, I kind of hate to say this, but would it really be the end of the world if the debate team couldn't keep going? I mean, does anyone really care all that much about debate?
The people on the team do. Most of us have been debating since high school, and it's really important to us. And it can be really good career preparation. You learn research skills, you learn, to communicate, to think on your feet, you learn teamwork. My father's a lawyer, and when he was in college, he went to college over in England, he was involved in debate, and he says it was a wonderful way to train for the courtroom. He's the one who talked me into joining the team.
Well, I'm just saying, except for a few people on the team, how does having a debate team really benefit the university?
Oh, don't even get me started. For one thing, there's the whole matter of school tradition. I mean, did you know that this school has had a debating team for over 100 years? And over the years, we've won a dozen or more regional tournaments and a couple of national tournaments. Then there's the prestige. We haven't had a good football or basketball team for years, but our debate team is always one of the best in the region. A good debate team attracts people who debated in high school, and they're always some of the top students. And a lot of famous people are on college debate teams. President John F. Kennedy, for one, and...
Okay, you've sold me.
And we're not even asking for that much. It's like a millionth of what the school spends on football and basketball. I mean, I don't have anything against sports teams, but...
Still, I can't see why you're going to talk to Dean Metzger. She's dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. She's not in charge of the university budget.
No, I know. You're right. And we tried to get an appointment with President Fisher, but his assistant kept saying he was too busy right now and wasn't able to meet with us. So Kurt came up with the idea of talking to Dean Metzger. He said Dean Metzger's fair. She has that reputation anyway. And she's, willing to listen. So, I don't know, maybe if we can convince her, then she can persuade President Fisher and the Board of Chancellors not to cut our budget so much.
Well, if anyone can convince her, you can. I'll tell you, though, if I were you, I'd keep trying to get a meeting with President Fisher. Talking to Dean Metzger won't hurt, but really, President Fisher is the person whose mind you have to change.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 1. Why does the woman mention her father? Question 2. How does the man feel about the woman's appointment with Dean Metzger? Listen to a conversation between two students.
Hey, Julie, want to go see a movie tonight?
Oh, wish I could, but I'm on my way home to study. I have a midterm in my math class tomorrow.
How are your midterms going?
So far, so good. The only one I'm at all worried about is the math exam tomorrow. How about you? Don't you have any midterm exams?
As a matter of fact, I do have one in geology class tomorrow, but there's nothing I can do tonight to get ready for it.
What sort of test is it? Multiple choice or essay?
Neither, actually. Dr. Fowles gives us a mineral sample and we have an hour to figure out what it is. We work in teams of 2.
How on earth do you do that? I mean, a rock's a rock, isn't it?
Actually, there are a number of tests you can perform on minerals to figure out what they are. First off, you just look carefully at the sample.
Okay, what do you look for?
Well, you check the mineral's color, although that's one of the most unreliable tests.
Why? Why would that be unreliable?
Because a lot of minerals have impurities that change their color. For example, pure quartz is clear, but then you also have white quartz, rose quartz, smoky quartz. It's all the same mineral, but different colors. Another thing to look for is luster.
You mean how shiny it is?
That's right. The way light reflects off the mineral. Most minerals that contain metals tend to have a shiny, metallic luster. Non-metallic rocks often look dull. Then you can do a taste test.
Ew, yuck! I wouldn't taste a mineral sample. Who knows where the mineral sample has been?
Well, it can help you identify certain minerals. For example, halite has a salty taste. Probably the most useful test of all is the hardness test. Have you ever heard of the Mohs scale?
Huh? The what scale?
It's a scale that indicates how hard a mineral is. We have a kit that we use that contains samples of minerals, of known minerals that, have a certain hardness. It goes from talc at number 1, talc is so soft you can scratch it with your fingernail, to diamonds at number 10. Diamonds are the hardest.
I know. They're the hardest substance in the world. Do you actually have a diamond in your kit?
Yeah, sure, a tiny little industrial diamond. So let's say you can scratch your sample with fluorite, which is number 4 on the scale, but not with, gypsum. That's number 2. Then on the Mohs scale, you,
Then the sample must be about 3 on that scale, right?
Right. So you look on the list that comes with the kit, and you know it's one of those minerals that is about 3 on the scale. Another good test is the streak test, which tells you the true color of a mineral.
I thought you said color is unreliable.
Oh, right, I did. But, see, the streak test shows you the true color of the mineral. You take your sample and rub it against a piece of unglazed porcelain, okay? And look at the color of the streak on the porcelain. Remember all those different colors of quartz I mentioned? Well, if you do a streak test on those, the streak on the porcelain looks the same, no matter what color the mineral appears to be. Oh, and my favorite is the acid test. You pour a little bit of acid, of vinegar, say, on the sample, and sometimes with a certain kind of mineral, one that contains calcium, it fizzes and foams. It's really cool. And then there's the specific gravity test, the ultraviolet test. That one's kind of fun, too. Oh, and the blowpipe test. And then...
Wait, stop. I get the picture. And after you've done all these tests, you can identify any mineral?
Well, usually. Not always, but usually. My partner and I have done a couple of practice runs, and we didn't have any trouble figuring out what mineral we were looking at. So I'm pretty sure we can do the same tomorrow.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you. Question 3. How does the man explain his geology midterm exam to the woman? Question 4. What is the woman's attitude towards the taste test? Question 5. Why does the man mention quartz? Question 6. What is the man's attitude toward his geology midterm?